Code Blue, for whatever reason, just exploited vulnerabilities that we had certainly in our industrial businesses. We were ripping servers out of walls, and then the first airplane hit the towers. We had an office in the towers, right? So we knew we had colleagues there, and sadly, it turns out that we had colleagues in the aircraft as well. And I just remember that even talking about it now sends a shiver up my spine, because we're cornerstone of American industry. We're being disabled by a sophisticated cyber attack, and now there's a physical attack going on in the financial heart of the country. This is not good.
Welcome to this week's Cognitas Global podcast. The theme, as you know, is a life less ordinary, and I'm very pleased to introduce a friend of mine today, Mr. Martin Simpson. Martin, welcome.
Thanks, Lawrie. Really good to see you on a dreary Friday afternoon.
Indeed. So, Martin, what I want to talk about today, currently you and I are sharing some interests. Well, you're more current in aviation than me, and we'll talk more about that. We're sharing some current interests because you and I are working together, doing some cyber exercising, and we'll talk again more about that at the end. So this is really about you. It's not about me. As I say, we share a great mutual interest in aviation, and I know you have a story to tell. Where do we start? Both of us have been pilots. I've not flown for a while. Both of us have owned aircraft, which is a bit like standing in a shower, ripping up £50 notes in a cold shower. And you're still doing that. So you can tell us of all the misery of all that in a minute. Martin Simpson, who is he?
Well, let me try and give you that an abbreviated version of that. So I did a degree in communication systems engineering from the University of Portsmouth. I was very, very privileged in that I was sponsored through my university education by the Royal Air Force, and prior to that I also had a sixth form scholarship, so I was given a little bit of money to get through my A-levels, which I then obviously spent on a car like everyone else did. I think very, very lucky to get that. I was one of only a dozen people out of something like a couple of thousand applicants, so amazing. And then on top of that, I was also very privileged to be awarded 2 flying scholarships, so that was how I ended up kind of affording my path into flying. So I got a Royal Air Force flying scholarship, and then I also received an Air League flying scholarship as well. So that contributed quite significantly towards my pilot's license as a 17-year-old. Much to my dad's amusement, it took me less hours to solo an aeroplane than it did a motor car, because I had to take my driver's test twice. And that was it, really. And I think most people who know me and look at my LinkedIn profile or any of my social media channels, I'm madly passionate about aviation and flying anything with wings and typically an engine, although like yourself, I initially learned to fly gliders as a 15, 16-year-old in the Air Cadets. My mum will tell you that I was 18 months old and went to a little airfield called Andrewsfield in Essex, where I grew up. And apparently I got out of the car on my reins, as was the standard thing for a kid born in the 70s. And I tried to run up to this aircraft, and my mum says that ever since then I was sort of thunderstruck by aviation, and I've never not looked at an aeroplane as it's gone past ever since. So that triggered, I suppose, a lifelong love affair. I always wanted to be a fighter pilot. When I grew up, I'm 47 years old. I'd still like to be a fighter pilot. Unlikely to happen anytime soon now, sadly.
On the top of aircraft, we've both flown vintage aircraft. You now own a Chipmunk, actually, which is an aircraft that I have flown before and is in my 13 aircraft in my logbook. Tell me a little bit. Well, no, tell me about the aircraft you had before the Chipmunk.
I responded like a true grown-up when I left Cranwell and had my license, and I thought, I don't want to fly anymore. I don't want to go anywhere near an airplane. It's all too upsetting. So I didn't go anywhere near a small aircraft for 18, 19 years. And for my 40th birthday, I was super privileged to get a trip in a 2-seat Spitfire. That was effectively pouring gallons of fuel on long dormant embers of a passion. I had a phenomenal trip, absolutely loved it. And I came back from that sort of saying, right, I need aviation back in my life. So I, recognizing that I'm probably too long in the tooth to be a commercial pilot, how do I sort of scratch the itch of flying in a way that is satisfying and I continue the development? I think something I'm quite critical of in general aviation is people get their license and then they just kind of carve holes in the sky, sort of drawing straight lines to go and have a 250-pound cheeseburger somewhere far away, right? Yeah. That's not what I wanted to do, and that's partly why I didn't carry on my flying in my 20s, because I couldn't afford to do it and be as capable and as credible as I wanted to be. So I flew the Spit, and then I pretty much drew a roadmap, right, aspirationally, and anyone listening to this will laugh and go, no chance, but aspirationally, before I die, I want to fly a single-seat, single-engined World War II fighter. That is my aspiration. You know what? And if I don't actually do that and I get pretty close, I'm going to have an amazing time on the way. So I renewed my pilot's license, flew initially the sort of standard span cam PA-28 type stuff that you see at every little local airfield. But vintage aircraft is my passion, flying the old stuff. So I did a tailwheel conversion on an airplane called Super Cub. So tailwheel aircraft, for those of you that don't know, have slightly different characteristics to more modern aircraft, which have a nose wheel, tricycle undercarriage. And those characteristics really manifest themselves on or near the ground. So you have to be quite careful taking off and landing in tailwheel aircraft. So I flew the Cub for a bit, and then it got deemed that I was probably capable enough to fly the Tigermoth, which is a bigger handful of an aircraft. So I went on to convert to the Tiger. I've flown the Tiger quite a lot now through the Tiger Club in Essex. So not far from Dartford, we fly from a little airfield called Damon's Hall. And I also fly the Tiger with the Cambridge Flying Group out of Old Warden Airfield. So I don't think anyone would ever claim to be an expert flying the Tigermoth. I am still definitely a novice. I've got something like 55 odd hours in the Tiger. So I can get her in the air and get her back down again. But she's an amazing little airplane. I then flew an airplane called a Turbulent, which is something that most people have never heard of. That's effectively a moped with wings. And that's the first single-engined aeroplane I ever flew. So the first time you go solo is the first time you fly it. So you brief and you do everything that you've been told, and you get airborne and you putter around the Essex skies at 60 knots. There's anyone who's familiar with the aeroplane will say there's only one speed: you climb, cruise, and crash at 60 knots, and that's it's pretty much a true statement. But so I've been lucky enough to do some formation work in the Turbulent, and then I got the opportunity to buy a share in a 1942 Harvard. So she was a youngster compared to the Tigermoth. So the Tigermoth that I fly most is the second oldest airworthy Tigermoth in the world. She was made in 1933. So I've flown her quite extensively. The Harvard, or the T6. So again, if I can go down the rabbit warren of aviation nerdery, in the Commonwealth Air Forces, Royal Air Force, South African Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, etc., we called the airplane Harvard. It was an American designed aircraft, and they called it the T6 Texan. Our aircraft was marked up or wore the scheme of a US Air Force squadron, the 353rd, from the 353rd Fighter Group based in Reydon in Suffolk during World War II. So because she wore US markings, we all referred to her as a T6 as opposed to Harvard. Now, she is a proper aeroplane. And when you talk about taking £50 note and rolling them up, increase that by a factor when you're talking about the Harvard. An amazing aeroplane, an absolute privilege to have been her custodian for a couple of years.
Well, let me get this right. So you criticise those people that fly spam cans, and these are these standard Cessnas and Pipers for a £250 cheeseburger. I know what you mean by that, £125 an hour, two ways. But then you fly that to justify that for paying, what, £600-700 for a cheeseburger, is that right? Or...
Well, I don't usually get as far as paying for the cheeseburgers, to be honest. I wasn't criticising. Everyone's horse is sausage, right? So PA-28s absolutely have their place, and they're a great little airplane. What's that phrase they say? In a boat owner's life, the two happiest days: the day they buy it and the day they sell it. I mean, I miss her terribly because she was such a phenomenal aeroplane. But my goodness, every time I looked at her, there were significant sums of money leaving my bank account. But you don't dwell on that. You dwell on the amazing experiences. So for example, it's amazing that I can even tell this story. The guy that taught me to fly, another co-owner, a guy called Mark Levy, is an absolute legend in the warbird community and flies pretty much everything that's out there. He sort of gifted me some of his knowledge and taught me to fly the Harvard, which is a escalation yet again from the Tigermoth. So the first time I went solo was at Duxford, the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. So for anyone who sort of knows their history, Duxford is the mecca of vintage aviation in the UK. Absolutely steeped in history. Douglas Bader flew from Duxford during the Battle of Britain. It's where he initiated the concept of the big wing. So to fly my own 1942 Warbird solo around that circuit. Yeah, I'm not going to lie. When I landed and taxied in and shut down, there was a little bit of dust in my eye. That was hugely emotional. And then when you just think about the history of the actual aeroplane itself, so she was built in 1942 in Dallas. She went to South Africa, where she was part of an Empire training school. So hundreds of baby pilots going through the Commonwealth training system would have flown that aircraft. Then went over to the South African Air Force, then got bought by the Portuguese, and we think she fought in Rhodesia. The paperwork goes not Rhodesia, Angola. The paperwork goes a little bit fuzzy over those years, but she's had the reinforced points under the wings where we think she might have had weapons of some form installed. And then she eventually made it onto the civil register in the UK in the late 70s. And then my two partners bought her, and then they invited me in during COVID. So there were three of us. So as an aircraft, she has a phenomenal story, and we named her after, as say, a P-51 Mustang that flew here in World War II.
So the notes you're ripping up are a smaller denomination now because you sold her and got a chipmunk, and you can afford the cheeseburger now. Well, maybe a burger, right, yeah. But not the cheese, but...
So financially, I can now afford the cheeseburger. The problem is I've now traded a 650 horsepower engine for a 120 horsepower engine. And for those of you that know me in real life, I'm probably more of a 650 horsepower guy. So eating too many cheeseburgers and trying to get airborne in a chippy would probably be quite a challenge. So more salads needed. So we sold the aircraft last year. She's gone to a new home down in Kent, which is it was sad and almost relieving in some ways. I swore I'd never buy another airplane, and then got invited for coffee, and next thing I knew, I was part owner in a 1951 Chipmunk.
That's how it happens.
Yeah.
Well, I had a little Victor Air Tourer, which wasn't so expensive. Look, real great fun, semi-aerobatic, two-seater, New Zealand trainer, Australian Air Force trainer as well. Was great. Yeah. Was built in 69, I think it was. So again, not so old, but had a lot of fun in that. But again, there comes a stage when other projects take precedent, families, stuff like that as well, Let's just mention very briefly, you came to us actually a little while ago. We helped you out with some stuff around graphic design for a trip you wanted to take. I don't know if you just want to mention that briefly. I know it's something you still want to do. Bit tricky with the old geopolitics going on, but, aspirational.
Yeah, well, it's still on the agenda, right? And it might be something that I do when I'm a bit older now. But myself and my wingman on the expedition, we're still really passionate about the idea. And again, thank you to Nick and Rob, because they were absolutely amazing generous with their time and amazing with their skills to help us build that media. So we wanted to, or we still plan to replicate the days of vintage aviation back in the 20s and 30s by flying down the old mail route, the former mail route from London to Cape Town. So that will take you down through the east coast of Africa. The idea was we'll do that in a pair of Tigermoths. So the Tigermoth's the closest aeroplane you can sort of track its heritage back all the way to the DH9s of that originally flew that route as part of the Imperial Airways or whatever it was called back then. And we wanted to do that to raise awareness of vintage aviation, but kind of inspire a generation to take flight. So that journey, that route was going to take us through some of the most underprivileged parts of the world, and we wanted to create some sort of legacy. We're both fathers to young daughters. Women are massively underrepresented in aviation. I think only 6.4% of professional aviators are female. So we need to address that balance, right? The idea was we wanted to raise awareness of that, and that would be a key sort of theme message within the journey. Amy Johnson's aeroplane, sadly, she's gone back to the States to be auctioned off. Up until recently was in Kenya, and that's the DH-60, which is the big sister of the DH-82 Tigermoth. There's a direct line there. But sadly, there was always an inherent level of risk in this trip. And then with what's happened in Sudan and broader instability in the Sahel region, the inherent risk started to just really get too high, and so we've had to put it in the long grass for now.
So, poor excuse, mate. The fact that you're worried about getting kidnapped, murdered, and your aircraft stolen and burned is not something really that I thought you would have been concerned about. But
it's good that I'm friends with you, right? You're good at crisis management, so you can manage the narrative when we're on Al Jazeera or whatever.
Well, look, I mean, I'm hoping that still might happen, that trip, because it's great. And I think probably in this podcast, we might even be able to show some graphics of that trip as well. So
You've got, Nick and Rob did that amazing graphic of the route, and look, I mean, it's so exciting, and we had interest from TV producers. Yeah, we've got people on board. It was all there, ready to go. Now, the other sort of headline is that my wingman, this guy called Goff, is ex-army chap that flies for BA now. We got a bit carried away with ourselves, and we thought, hold on, is this going to be a trilogy? Should we think about a trilogy here? Because the real prize here is London to Sydney. That's not been done in a Tigermoth since 1978. And the last chap to do that was a guy called David Sister, who I've met a couple of times now. Really fascinating, incredible man. Back in the day when the Air Force was a very different Air Force. So we would like to do the London to Sydney route. And another part of the trilogy is to do the Pacific Ring, starting in Anchorage all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. So that's probably looking like a more likely scenario in the short term. And what we'd do to make that more relevant to the continent is actually do that in an aeroplane called Stearman, which was kind of the American equivalent of the Tigermoth. Clearly being American, it's much bigger, more comfortable, a bit more rugged and robust, but actually flies quite a bit slower. Watch this space. That is something that we're talking about.
I'm just wondering about, how's Mrs. Simpson feel about not being able to buy the shopping for about the next 5 years to fund that sort of stuff then?
I think the comment was, just so long as the insurance is in place, you do whatever you want.
Go to Sudan.
Yeah.
Well, look, we're both rugby fans as well, of course. We're both Harlequins supporters and that. We see each other there quite often. So that's been something else that's brought us some cheaper enjoyment in our lives, I can honestly say.
And some misery.
Yeah. Fun, but miserable on occasions. So let's just talk about something else that's common interest as well. Perhaps you just want to explain the job that you do now, Martin, briefly, for our
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for an organisation called 324, and we are effectively the security practice within a larger company called Node4. My role for years now, in one form or another, I've always been involved in technology risk and resilience, or cybersecurity, or information security as it was back in the day. That's really when I started my career. When I left Cranwell, I went to GE, General Electric. I'm sure many people have heard of GE. This was back in the day under Jack Welch, when it was one of the world's most respected companies. I was lucky enough to win a place on their technology graduate scheme. And that's really my first foray into what was then information security. We used to call it technology controllership, I think it was as well. And a real defining moment for me was sadly the September 11th attacks. We were, as GE, I was chief of staff to the CISO then. We didn't call them CISOs, but a incredible lady called Marissa Baffardi, one of the best bosses I've ever had. And we were getting absolutely annihilated by a piece of malware called Code Blue. And a few months before, the first big malware that made headlines was called Code Red. That didn't really impact us too much, but Code Blue, I'm going to talk about this because it was 24 years ago now, but Code Blue, for whatever reason, just exploited vulnerabilities that we had certainly in our industrial businesses. We were ripping servers out of walls, and then the first airplane hit the towers. And I just remember that even talking about it now sends a shiver up my spine, because I remember thinking, no, this is something bad's happening here. We're cornerstone of American industry. We're being disabled by a sophisticated cyber attack, and now there's a physical attack going on in the financial heart of the country. This is not good. We had an office in the towers, right? So we knew we had colleagues there, and sadly it turns out that we had colleagues in the aircraft as well. But it was fascinating that we just all sort of pivoted into, let's fight the battle in hand now, which is stop the business going down because of this malware incident. And then we need to start thinking, and I think we all kind of had a moment of realization that this was, more was going to happen. Now, it turns out they were all completely unrelated, but, at the time, and I suppose that triggered my passion for, I suppose, really like stopping the bad guys from getting away with doing bad things. And that's really where my career's kind of gone ever since. So I stayed at GE for a number of years. Amazing company. Got approached to go to Deloitte. My plan was, I spoke to my sponsor at GE. My plan was to go to Deloitte just for a couple of years. I think the phrase used was consider it like an external MBA, then come back to GE. And I didn't. I really enjoyed being a consultant. I still enjoy being a consultant. I'm fundamentally quite nosy. And so I quite like understanding problems in my client organizations and trying to help them fix it, right? And sometimes they agree with me and sometimes they don't. And that's the great thing about being a consultant.
I'm just wondering about the truth about the rumours that you're head of a cyber activist group and responsible for a load of ransomware that's funding your aviation.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I wish I'd thought of that, Lawrie. That's a great idea. You can do ransomware for ransomware as a service, right? There are people you can contact and say, please target these companies. Would I count as an insider as well? That would probably be a true.
Well, if anybody wants to do any due diligence or character references on you, they can always come to me, and I could say how credible you were as a cyber activist. But on a more serious note, let's talk about that, where our paths cross now. And that's the whole thing about cybersecurity. Now, you're a cybersecurity specialist. We're learning and development consultancy that really specializes now in crisis management using our immersive platform View 360. We've got a whole host of clients that you know of, high profile. I'm not going to name them, but we run these cyber exercises. And a part of this cultural change towards this corporate responsibility now and addressing the issues of not it'll never happen to us, and it's about not if, but when now, really. And this is what you and I have been working together to try and change this and just bring this to the attention of corporations, really, that they need to start professionalizing their crisis management teams, investing in preventative measures. This is not going to stop. This is just going to get more and more sophisticated with AI. And this is about securing and preservation of jobs, your business, the psychological well-being of your workers, all of this stuff now. I mean, just give me your take on the current situation as you see it and your view of the corporate and cultural approach or attitude to this.
As you said, it's a really dynamic environment, and there's a lot of noise about the impact that AI is going to have on the cyber threat environment. And in classic sort of press hyperbole, we're all worried about the bad side of AI. But if the bad guys are using AI to be really, really clever, the good guys can use AI to be really, really clever. So you're going to be really, really clever together. What's the net outcome going to be, right? So as long as you're considering those threats and those risks to your business or your operations, AI is going to change the game. But I don't think it's not going to give the bad guys the critical advantage that some elements of the press would have you believe. I think there's a much broader, more sensible kind of mindset now. If you look at the UK financial services regulators and some of the regulations that are coming in Europe around DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, there's a recognition, look, disruption is going to happen. There will be incidents, and disruption through technology failure. That technology failure could be triggered by a cyber attack. I think cyber is a very broad church, and I've gone into client organizations where the loss of a device containing 10 million, 11 million customer records, that got classified as a cyber incident. Actually wasn't. It was physical theft or physical loss of a device, right? But it had data in electronic form. So where do the worlds of physical security and virtual security converge? And I think that's a really hot topic at the moment that is, becoming more and more recognized by organizations. But I think, look, the threats are there. I think you can do a lot of and I'm not a big advocate of sort of pushing the fear agenda here. There's a lot of basic stuff you can do to keep yourself away from the casual hacktivist or the kid in his mum's basement or whatever, right? And I think if you do the basic hygiene, right, you will make yourself, so you're not immune, but you'll make yourself a harder target, right? And I think if you look at a number of the incidents happened over the years, organizations just haven't been getting the basics right. I think we're seeing a marked improvement in at least awareness and recognition that the threat poses. And bearing in mind that threat doesn't necessarily have to be the classic malicious external actor that we all get excited about. That threat could be a non-malicious insider just trying to do their job and circumventing some controls, right? And that could lead to a breach of confidentiality or corruption of data integrity. There's a lot of noise about how much the threat is getting worse, but equally, I think maturity is getting worse. Businesses are more inherently resilient, arguably shifting to the cloud does sort of give you some inherent resilience up to a point, but there's also quite a lot of smoke and mirrors about how resilient you really are if you go take a cloud first strategy. For me, and to drag it back to aviation, you think about when we go flying, we are always thinking about what happens if, or I'm going to go and practice my landings without an engine. I'm going to go and practice my steep turns. I'm going to go and practice my navigation. What will I do if I lost my engine or I got an engine fire? Or you sit there as an amateur pilot like we are, and obviously professional aviators even more so. and you put yourself through, you think about the scenarios that could occur, and then you put yourself against them and go, okay, well, this is what I would do, and I practice it. So I rehearse it, I practice it, and I try to stay current. I try and do steep turns every couple of weeks to make sure I can fly accurately. I've said this before in other podcasts and white papers I've written. I think there's a lot from aviation that we could bring into the corporate world around briefing and debriefing. If you think about, again, sorry for another aviation anecdote, but I've got some friends that fly in the Battle of Britain Memorial flight. They fly the Lancaster, and I was able to sit in on one of their debriefing sessions. The engines have been shut down. They put the airplane to bed. First thing they do, sit around table, debrief. And it's just a brutal, honest assessment of everyone's performance and your own. My mate was saying, yeah, I was a bit slow on the turn on to final, right? Everyone had something to say that was constructive, but it was all out on the table. I don't think we do that in the commercial world. And
I think there's a reason why we don't do that. And that is, when you train to be a pilot, you're professionalizing your skills. So there's standards, you're out there practicing, all that sort of stuff. When you think about the role of a crisis manager or somebody that's promoted into a position of responsibility in a crisis, they may not receive any training. So, of course, when it all happens, what they're going to do. So I come back to this same thing around professionalizing this organizational or functional unit, the crisis management team, even just forgetting the need for this constant training and exercising, which is just a fact and advocated by all of those that have gone through now crisis or those that try and assist people in the crisis. You've got to make sure that your team know how to be effective and how to manage that as a team, as a professional unit. And I think that's, we're recognizing that that's missing, is something, we're trying to offer to address to companies. But also, yourself from, we did something this week, which was hugely successful with your parent company. But we also know that there's a lot of crisis management plans that have sat on the shelf that haven't perhaps been updated. They're there in essence. People are expecting because they've got them that the magic's going to happen. And the other problem is, of course, is that there's this whole reliance on a third party, so that in the cyber world, you think this IT company is going to come in and solve your problems, but they're not going to run your business. They are not going to help you continue to sell shoes or provide services of another nature and deal with your supply chain, deal with your customers, and deal with your reputational and financial risk. They're not going to do that. And that, I think, again, is this whole education about realizing that this responsibility has got to be correctly managed.
100%. And I was just going to quickly say, I just think the idea of exercising your response in the same way you exercise your body to stay fit, you therefore know that you're fit to respond to an incident when it occurs. And again, much like when I go flying, when I have an emergency, I've practiced that emergency, so I don't have to think about what I'm doing. There's muscle memory associated with, okay, this is what I'm going to do, right? And the same thing should be, 80 or 90% of your thinking should be done in preparation for a crisis, not when you're wrapped around the phone, trying to fight it for real.
90% planning and preparation, isn't it, really? 10% execution. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, look, Martin, it's been great, mate. We chat off camera and off mic about lots of stuff. I guess all I could say is continue to enjoy your flying. If you get bored about spending money, then just send some my way. I might go start flying again, perhaps, although it never gets any cheaper. But seriously,
the Chippy's a breath of fresh air. Don't worry, she's a lot more reasonable.
Mate, I can't believe your wife is saying that. The Chip is a breath of fresh air. Maybe I'll ask her.
She's not said that. She's not said that. I'm saying that.
Hopefully people that have listened to us will understand our passion across all areas of what we've discussed here, but particularly when it comes to addressing crisis, providing those type of services. You've mentioned 324. We'll put a plug-in for them on a website and so forth. But again, if there is anybody listening to this that's interested in having their business health checked or some advice, some assistance, you've got an expert in Martin. Give him a call, give me a call, whatever you want to do, and we'll see if we can help. Martin, it's been a great pleasure, mate. We'll meet next at the Quins, I suspect.
Yes.
And thank you very much for taking time to share your passion with us.
Cheers, Lawrie. Thanks, mate. Enjoyed it.
Cheers. Thanks, mate.